Friends, it's really a great honor and privilege for me to be here today to speak at the 63rd Annual Convention of the Indian Orthopedic Association, and I'm grateful to Professor Rajasekaran, the organizing chairman, for inviting me to speak to all of you. My field is somewhat different, but I'll try to give you an idea of some of the things that we have done and perhaps link it to your field and what my friend Dr. Devi Shetty will speak later. As she mentioned earlier, while I have had a career in the private sector at Infosys, over the last 10 years, I've really been working on public issues of how to use technology at scale to have better development in a country like India. India has the advantage of not having legacy systems. And when you don't have legacy systems and legacy technology, often you can leapfrog by doing something more radical than what is available elsewhere. And this opportunity came to me in 2009 when the then Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, invited me to join the Government of India to build a project to give every Indian a unique ID. Now that's giving 1.3 billion people an ID, so it's a non-trivial problem to solve. And it's also important to realize that many of these people don't have any documents whatsoever, because unlike in the West, where every birth is by and large registered, the US has 98% birth registration. In India, in many states, less than half the babies born are registered, and therefore they grow up and without any formal means of identification, which is not a problem earlier if they lived all their lives in one village, but with increasing movement and migration of Indians across the country, not having an ID becomes a huge problem for security, for getting a bank account, for getting access to a job. Everything links to having an identity, and that was the problem that I had to solve. We also had to solve this in a reasonable amount of time, and therefore, and that's one lesson I learned, when you're trying to do things at population scale, at the scale of 1 billion people, you have to think very differently. You have to think at very, very, very high volumes of transactions and very, very, very low costs. So you need both high volume and low costs. And therefore, we had to do something. And so when we actually built this technology platform, we took about 14 months to build the first version. We built it to enroll 1.5 million people a day. In other words, every day, 1.5 million people could enroll. And at peak, we had 35,000 enrollment stations across the country who were enrolling people, adding up to 1.5 million or so per day. And we needed that kind of scale to really do this in a reasonable amount of time. And also what we realized was that when there are so many people, when there are hundreds and millions of people without identity, there is, how do you establish uniqueness? Because our task was not just to give them an ID. It was to make sure that they got only one ID. That is, they didn't get multiple IDs. Because if you have multiple IDs, then you can game the system. And therefore, we had to very authoritatively prove that somebody got only one ID. And for that, he used a technology called biometric deduplication, which is based on the premise that everybody has a unique fingerprint or a biometric fingerprint. And if you make sure that a person with a particular unique fingerprint, biometric digital signature in some sense, if it is not repeated, then you know that you can give everybody only one ID. But nobody had solved this problem before. The largest database of biometrics at that time was about 100 million people, and we had to solve a problem for 10 times that, 1 billion people. So it was really an unsolved problem at that point. And we decided to use multiple biometrics. So we designed a system which had 10 fingerprints, the iris of both the eyes, as well as the photograph. And with that data, we established that somebody could be unique. But then the challenge was when somebody got enrolled, how to make sure that person had not enrolled earlier. And therefore, we had to compare every new enrollment to all the people we had in the database to make sure that the person had not enrolled under some other name. And to give you a size of the scale of this issue, if we already had 500 million people in the system, and 1 million people enrolled that day, we had to do 500 trillion pattern recognition matching at the back to establish whether the person was unique, new or not. So it was a fairly large problem. But one of the things we had the advantage was we built this using the newer technology that had come out of the US Silicon Valley, where to build these massive internet companies, they built a lot of new open source technology which was widely available. So we used this open source technology to build a very low cost platform for enrolling 1 billion people. So this was a very important project. It was done in the government. So it was a public sector project. It's a class of things which call as digital public goods. In other words, how do you create digital public goods at scale so that everybody can benefit? And this system was rolled out, and today 1.2 billion people are on this system. And what's important is that almost everyone, 97% of adults in India have the ID, and it is now becoming ubiquitous for all kinds of services. Importantly, it is a digital ID. If you go back and look at the history of IDs, typically they are paper-based IDs, a driving license, a passport, or so on. We built a completely digital ID on the cloud, which is an example of what I mean by leapfrogging. You can actually do things you can't do elsewhere. And the digital ID on the cloud can be verified online using a fingerprint, a photograph, an iris, or a one-time password to your phone. And this was again designed to be built at scale. And today the system does 1.2 billion online authentications a month. In other words, that's the scale of this operation. And all of them in a couple of seconds. So it's a highly scalable, high-performance system to do 1.2 billion authentications a month. And then we use the same infrastructure to do things like open a bank account or get a mobile connection. As you know, around the world today, to get a bank account or a mobile connection, many countries require something called Know Your Customer to make sure that you're a genuine person. And historically, those processes would take days and cost a lot of money. We designed a system to do electronic KYC in 2 minutes. And that system last year did 3.4 billion KYCs, again, to open bank accounts and mobile phones. So I think this is, again, I think a public good created across the country at scale. And we then linked this whole thing to a banking system. And today, about 600 million Indians have their bank accounts linked to the ID system. And that's how many people receive benefits. And India today runs the world's largest direct benefit transfer system, doing about $16 billion. And what's important is that one of the original reasons for this project was that India's welfare system was riddled with ghosts and duplicates, leading to a lot amount of diversion and corruption. And we essentially eliminated that by having a unique ID for everyone, and then linking the unique ID to the bank account, and making sure that money went directly into people's bank accounts. So this whole thing is what's called straight-through processing, electronic real-time money into bank accounts. So I think this is, again, part of infrastructure we built. And then we tried to solve another problem, and that problem actually, the problem statement was done once when Dr. Devishete and I met 10 years back, and he had just launched his program called Yashaswini, which is an insurance program. And I said, how do you make this work at scale? How do you make sure everybody gets? And I thought it was some medical issue he has to solve. He said, no, I need to solve the problem of making sure that everybody can pay 10 rupees a month into a bank account to pay the premium on this policy, because the policy was 60 rupees or something like that. So I realized that unless you make payments very, very simple to do, we can't really solve many other issues. So we built in India something called the Unified Payment Interface, which is a very sophisticated payment system from any bank account to any bank account, any mobile phone to any mobile phone in real time. And this is, again, a multi-party system. So every bank, Google is on it, companies, everybody can participate. And this is a very important infrastructure for making payments become cashless and digital. And having low-cost digital payments is the key to many other things you want to have in terms of transactions and payments. And this system, again, was built over the last 5 years by an organization called NPCI, National Payment Corporation of India. And they built this, and about 2 years back, in October of 2016, this system was only doing about 100,000 transactions a month. But after that, we had the whole demonetization and so on. And today, the system does 400 million transactions a month. So it's one of the largest systems for payments. And it's expected to cross 1 billion transactions a month in about a year's time. So these are all very, very important population scale large systems. Now, I think it's important to realize that the digital ID, and there are many other things we did, but I'll stick to these two. The digital ID is important to think of identity as a platform, because ID is not just related to one topic. ID is not just about opening a bank account or having a driver's license. ID is fundamental to proving your existence in a digital world. And you apply that to a large set of things, and that equally well applies to the healthcare industry, because if you're going to have healthcare insurance, you're going to have premiums, you're going to have claims, you're going to have electronic health records, all of them ultimately need to be connected through an ID system. And so where this is going now is using this ID system and with appropriate requirements for security, privacy, and so on, a whole architecture on top of that is being built for electronic health records and electronic things. And this whole thing is referred to as the India Health Stack. So it's sort of a set of components that sit on top of a digital identity which can be used for healthcare and so on. This, in fact, has been, the specifications of this have been notified by Niti Aayog. So it's a public document which defines a certain way of doing things. But what's also important is a second part of all this infrastructure, which is that it allows people to have control over the data. And that's a big issue today in the world. If you see the whole challenge we're having with internet companies and so on, the question is who owns this data? Where does this data sit? And typically data either sits with companies which are then able to use that data to do advertising and so on, or data sits with governments which are use the data for surveillance. So, but we really need to think about how to put data into the hands of people so people are empowered with their own data, because data is going to be a huge thing, and everything we do in the world will generate more data. And if we can get people to own their data and people to be empowered to use that data, then you can get a whole new paradigm. And that's particularly true for a developing country, because unlike in the West, where people became data rich after they were economically well off, in India, people are going to be data rich before they're economically well off. In other words, a person with a smartphone, whether it's in Boston or Bihar, will generate the same amount of digital traffic, except that the per capita income may be $40,000, $50,000 and $1,000. So clearly, so therefore, if you think about the fact that people will be data rich before they're economically well off, can we think about data as something which empowering the people can be used to improve their lives? In other words, can I use my own data to get better healthcare, better education, better financial services, better credit? And so in India, we designed something called the data empowerment architecture using all this technology, where I can get access to my data to do something. And the first use of that is actually in the lending sector, in the credit sector, where somebody who wants a loan can get his financial data from different locations, give it to the lender. Lender will analyze the data, maybe they'll use some AI or something, and then figure out whether I'm a good credit risk and give me the appropriate loan. So but that is just the first use case of data empowerment for the purpose of financial thing. Equally well, it will apply for healthcare tomorrow, because again, unlike my health records sitting in some other location, if I have access to my own health records wherever they're sitting, and I can empower myself to get my data and give it for a specialist or to get some treatment, then I'm empowering myself. And so data empowerment is, again, a very important part of the infrastructure which is coming up in India. So all these are, examples of, and of course, micropayments, I talked about it. We can make small payments at zero cost. We have the lowest cost payment infrastructure anywhere in the world. So all this is really foundational stuff. In other words, this is all horizontal capabilities where every individual has access to identity, every individual has access to electronic payments at scale, every individual has access to their own data, and now it's up to different vertical industries or vertical specializations to apply these horizontal capabilities. So the financial sector industry will use this data for lending or credit risk. The education sector will use this for certificates, degrees, and so on. And of course, the healthcare sector would use this for electronic health records and payments and making, creating portability of your health information. So I believe that this is something very unique which we have built in India. And it's really a great, I think, lesson for all of us that we really, if we're going to solve India's challenges, which are very, very urgent, with so many people demanding so many things, so much aspiration being unleashed. You can't do it really at a subscale way. You have to do it at population scale. Technology today enables you to do that. The same technology can also be used for not so good things, but if it is done wisely, we can use the technology for good things. And we have, as I said, many examples in India which actually demonstrate the benefits of applying this at scale and creating applications, solutions, infrastructure, which actually empower people to run better lives. Thank you very much.